Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Caryl Churchill's play Cloud 9, which is probably Churchill's best known plays and one of my favorite plays. I've actually gotten to see this produced twice, and it's an amazing show to see, and it's a delight to read. Now, Cloud 9 is a play of two halves. The first half is set in British colonial Africa in the 1870s, and the second half is set in London in the 1970s. The play itself came out in 1979, so this would be contemporary for the play itself. One interesting thing to note is that several of the characters, Edward, Betty, and Victoria, appear in both the 1870s first half and the 1970s second half. But even though 100 years of chronological time has passed, only 25 years have passed for them. So they're only 25 years older in the 1970s scenes than they are in the 1870s scenes. So that's one element of Brechtian unreality that Churchill uses in this play. This is a very, very deeply Brechtian play. And essentially what I mean by that is Churchill uses a lot of non-realist or non-naturalist performance techniques to continually remind the audience that we're seeing a play, that we're seeing something constructed in order to make a social point. And that's part of the reason why the first half of this play is set in the 1870s in British colonial Africa, is because one Brechtian technique is to set plays about contemporary issues in historical settings, so that viewers of those plays will feel a critical distance, so that they can reflect carefully about what happens in those historical scenes, and then bring that knowledge to bear on the questions facing them in their own times. So much of what this play is actually focused on is gender performance. So this is very much aligned with sort of Judith Butler and what will become in the 1990s really third wave feminism. This idea of gender as fluid and gender as performances that can fail. And what I mean by that is, for Judith Butler, gender is reified performances. That is, there are things that we do as physical beings within societies that read as masculine or feminine. Performances that are socially coded in these particular ways. But we don't always properly perform our gender. And one of the big arguments that Butler makes in her book, Gender Trouble, is that when those performances fail, when we don't perform gender correctly, this highlights the very performative nature of gender itself. Cloud 9 really sort of runs on this economy. And we actually get this starting from the cast list, or the characters list. Because in the first half of the play, we have Clive, a colonial administrator, but then we have his family. So his family is Betty, his wife, played by a man; Joshua, his black servant, played by a white; Edward, his son, played by a woman; and Victoria, his daughter, a dummy. And that's a literal dummy. That's not an assessment of her character. Like, she is a doll. So we have, and actually in the second half, there's only one character whose the actor's identity should specifically not align with the character's identity, and that's Kathy, who's Lynn's 5-year-old daughter, played by an adult male actor. But the absurdity of this, the disconnect between the way that the actors' physical bodies present and the way that their characters present is highlighted right from the beginning of the play. We have this song. So all of them sing this sort of hymn to England. And this is another Brechtian technique. Like, this is clearly a non-naturalistic introduction. It's almost like in Fiddler on the Roof, where they sing tradition, and each social group, the mothers, the fathers, the sons, the daughters, etc., etc., sort of introduce themselves and their role in society. We get the same kind of thing here. Because after they all sing this sort of opening bit, Clive says, "This is my family. Though far from home, we serve the king wherever we may roam." Or we serve the queen, wherever we may roam. "I'm a father to the natives here, and father to my family so dear." Stage directions say he presents Betty. She's played by a man. "My wife is all I dreamt a wife should be, and everything she is, she owes to me." And then Betty sings, "I live for Clive. The whole aim of my life is to be what he looks for in a wife. I am a man's creation, as you see, and what men want is what I want to be." So we get the same kind of thing with Joshua, introduced as a faithful black servant, even though he's played by a white actor. We get the same thing with Edward, introduced as someone that Clive is trying to raise into a man, despite Edward's struggles to become one, etc., etc. So we have those elements, like this initial ironic opening where the characters are introduced and the disconnect between the actors' physical bodies and the characters that they're playing is specifically highlighted. Again, this is a Brechtian technique. It's a non-naturalist technique. It's meant to show us the disconnect between gender performance and gender identity in this case. But as the first half of the play goes on, we get increasingly complicated gender and sexuality identities. Edward is repeatedly scolded for playing with Victoria's doll. He's mocked for not being sufficiently good at sports, etc., etc. So Edward is continually sort of run down and oppressed for being very effeminate, etc., etc. Clive is actually the straightest character of all of the characters here. But even he is not sort of properly Victorian, prudish, repressed, etc., etc., because he does have an affair with their neighbor. When their neighbor, Mrs. Saunders, comes to seek shelter, because there's big fears about a native uprising, etc., etc. And I mean, he has this, in some ways, quite obscene sexual obsession with her. Like, at one point, he says, "Let me tell you something first. Since you came to the house, I've had an erection 24 hours a day, except for 10 minutes after the time we had intercourse." And he later tells her, "Caroline, if you were shot with poisoned arrows, do you know what I'd do? I'd fuck your dead body and poison myself. Caroline, you smell amazing. You terrify me. You are dark like this continent, mysterious, treacherous. When you rode to me through the night, when you fainted in my arms, when I came to you in your bed, when I lifted the mosquito netting, when I said, 'Let me in, let me in. Oh, don't shut me out, Caroline, let me in.'" And then he disappears under her skirts. So Clive's pretty weird. Clive's not entirely healthy, but he is he and Mrs. Saunders are still probably the straightest characters in the first half. Betty, Clive's wife, she is beloved by Ellen, who's Edward's governess. Betty doesn't entirely seem to understand Ellen's feelings, but Ellen clearly has same-sex attraction to Betty. There is a moment where they kiss. So, I mean, we've got, again, these complicated gender performances. Harry Bagley is the other big one. Harry's an interesting character, and he's a difficult character to pin down. He makes a move on Betty at one point, which Clive finds out about. And Clive is upset, primarily with Betty, despite the fact that he's been having this somewhat obscene sexual relationship with Mrs. Saunders. He is not on board with her almost considering cheating on him. So Clive is also a hypocrite, which is always fun. Very, very Victorian in some ways. But Harry is gay, essentially. I mean, he's obviously closeted because this is the Victorian era and being gay was a crime. But we find out that Harry has had sex with Edward. We find out that he has had sex with Joshua. And when Clive makes this sort of extended speech about the beauty of friendship between men, Harry misunderstands him and thinks that Clive is coming out to him. And when Harry reveals his own sexual orientation, Clive is disgusted. And he actually says, so Harry says, "I struggle against it. You cannot imagine the shame. I've tried everything to save myself." Clive says, "The most revolting perversion. Rome fell, Harry, and this sin can destroy an empire." Harry says, "It's not a sin, it's a disease." And Clive says, "A disease more dangerous than diphtheria. Effeminacy is contagious. How I have been deceived. Your face does not look degenerate. Oh, Harry, how did you sink to this?" So this idea of degeneracy, of sexual perversion as an existential threat to the empire is very Victorian. And so we get a lot of that. It's an interesting sort of mixed bag in terms of gender and sexuality in the first half of the play. Because on the one hand, Churchill seems not to condemn. And I think that's probably actually her attitude here. She seems to endorse queer sexuality, LGBT identity, etc., etc. And I think that's the right move. Obviously, I'm on board with this as an ethical stance. But we've also got characters who do condemn, Clive being the most significant one. But Harry Bagley has internalized homophobia. Edward is at times very ugly with his brattiness, almost his defensive attempts to not be seen by his father as effeminate and unworthy, and that sometimes manifests in racism, in violence almost, or spite toward his sister, toward his mother, toward his governess, etc., etc. So it's a complicated depiction of sexuality in the first half of this play. The second half of the play picks this up. And again, we've got that Brechtian shift where we move 100 years in the future, but Edward, Betty, and Victoria only aged 25 years. So Edward and Victoria are now adults in 1970s London. I don't think the second half is as interesting, if I'm honest. A lot of it is about difficulties of maintaining relationships, of trusting your partner, of establishing supportive relationships, etc., etc. The one bit I do find really, really interesting is that at one point, Edward, Victoria, and Lynn have this picnic / ritual summoning / orgy in which they attempt to, Edward, who's openly gay in the 1970s scenes, they attempt to conjure up a primordial goddess figure. Victoria chants the names of a number of ancient goddesses and then says, "Goddess of many names, oldest of the old, who walked in chaos and created life, hear us calling you back through time, before Jehovah, before Christ, before men drove you out and burnt your temples. Hear us, lady. Give us back what we were. Give us the history we haven't had. Make us the women we can't be." So this idea of like evoking cultures, evoking religions, evoking values that predate, especially the patriarchal structures that were so central to Victorian Britain, and providing or escaping to these sort of alternative spheres, alternative worldviews. I think it's a really interesting counterpoint or option that the play suggests.